just want to express my gratitude to the Covenant class for having me back again. I always look forward to it. There's always lively discussion and lots of spirited interchange. It's also great when we can take some time and slow down and spend some time with texts, especially with texts that you might not have looked at as closely over the years. And these two books, my guess is you're familiar with the rough contours of the story. You may have read them, but we're going to take a deeper dive the next couple of weeks. Just a word of appreciation once again to everybody at FPC. Drake and Mary D are dear friends, and Amy and Derek are two of our closest friends in Richmond. And Josh was a former student of mine, and his ministry here is clearly thriving. Kate is a current student of mine, and I've just to the point of what we're doing over the next few weeks. I've learned a lot from FPC members about Ruth over the years because I've taught it a lot, and in particular, I think of papers, lengthy papers, directed studies, research papers that have been done by Nicole Ball, Sandy Irby, and others who are members of FPC who have helped me understand Ruth better. They may be otherwise occupied, or they know what I have to say about Ruth, which is why they're not here today. But tell them, tell them that I gave them a shout out. And just one side note: gratitude to the Covenant class for supporting Crossover. I just think that's one of the best ministries, nonprofits in Richmond. Helen, my wife, who will be here some Sundays, is a primary care physician and volunteers there every Tuesday. And they're just doing the Lord's work in so many ways. So thanks for supporting them. All right. Appropriate to talk about Crossover Healthcare Ministries because their primary mission is to support those who are in a difficult situation in a place that's foreign to them, and that's what Ruth is about. So good lead in to what we're talking about. All right. You might want to, if you have a Pew Bible, you might want to turn to the book of Ruth. We won't necessarily we're not going to read the whole thing, but we will have occasion to refer to verses repeatedly here. And if you need access to one, you can it's easy to flip past it because it's only 4 chapters. The easy way to remember this is by thinking of my favorite Lyle Lovett album, Joshua Judges Ruth. So it falls after the book of Judges, but I'm going to say in a minute, that's not where it falls in the Jewish canon, and I'll explain why that's the case in just a minute. This is the order in our Protestant canon, but it's not the order in the Jewish scriptures. All right, so couple of just introductory points. What's the purpose of this story? It is undoubtedly to show heroism, courage, fidelity, faithfulness, both to God and to the main characters in the story for each other. It is also, I think, a testament to the Moabite ancestress of David. The fact that David's is descended from a Moabite woman, which is a provocative claim to make, as we will see in a moment. We know who the main characters are. If you've looked at it before, we have 3 men in the story who immediately drop dead in the first couple of verses. Then we have Ruth, Naomi, and Orpah. Orpah returns and doesn't stay with Naomi. And then we're introduced to Boaz in chapter 2. We'll talk about him in a minute. We also have, next week, this guy who is another relative who will factor into our discussion next week. So those are the main characters. There is a sort of historical context we want to get our hands around, and this is something we don't pay enough attention to when we study the Bible in general. And that is that we are dealing with a patriarchal social structure predicated on what we refer to, anthropologists and others refer to as a house of the father system. If you did an accordance search, if you did a search of how many times house of the father shows up in the Bible, you'd be quite surprised because it shows up a whole bunch. A good and famous example, when Abram, in Genesis 12, it said, pick up your belongings and go from your father's house to the land that I'm going to show you. Throughout the Abraham story, there's a reference to the house of his father. And we have this patriarchal tree that we could draw with the ancestors in Genesis. One's safety and security and very identity in the world of the Bible was not built around the nation. It was built around the household. Your chance for survival, your chance for anybody's chance in order to be able to live comfortably, to live securely, to have access to food and basic resources, the litmus test for whether that would happen is whether a person was affiliated with or related to in some way with the house of the father structure. This is and many societies organize themselves around this way. Just think of, I've mentioned Abraham, but think of all the ancestry types of language that we have throughout the Old Testament, but also think of the fact that Jesus is so closely identified with his parents, and the first thing we find in the Gospel of Matthew is a genealogy. So the house of the father system. Now, you have a patriarch at the head of a hierarchical grouping that can include what we call segmented genealogies, which means brothers and sisters or other immediate peers, or linear genealogies, which would be children and grandchildren. And a household could also consist of servants, those who were sojourning, the resident aliens who happened to attach themselves to a household. But this was a functioning unit, usually dedicated to farming, but often dedicated to other trades. They might have been engaged in animal husbandry, they might have been engaged in winemaking or textiles or other finer pursuits. But the family trade, usually farming, was what provided the household access to food and basic resources. Now, why am I going into all this? Because the whole book of Ruth relates to this issue. So if you think about this in sort of anthropological family terms, if you think about a house of the father system, who would be the most vulnerable people in a society? Who would be the most susceptible to poverty and destitution in a system like this? What categories? Women. Well, women, yes, definitely women, but more specifically, widows. Why widows? Because they lose their house of the father. What's the first thing that happens in Ruth? All the males drop dead, making them very vulnerable. So widows, who else? Children, but specifically what kind of children? Orphans. Yeah, not just children, orphans. Orphans lack access to a house of the father as well. Who else? One other category. Foreigners. Those who are perhaps seen as outsiders and are not particularly seen as worthy of membership in a house of the Father. And there's variation in the Bible as to how this will look. So we have to understand this system in order to understand what's happening in the book of Ruth, this house of the Father system. Now, so that's point 3. Point 4, I would point out is that, this is something I pointed out earlier, the book of Ruth in the Jewish canon is part of what we call the 5 scrolls. Esther, Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes, Ruth, and Lamentations. And these are books that all deal in some way or another with the relationship between God and humanity, but also with where is God in the midst of what's happening in the story. God seems to be a bit more absent in these stories. These books are probably placed in this section of the canon because they're a good bit later. Ruth is placed after Joshua and Judges in our canon, but the primary reason for that seems to be that that the book of Ruth is seen as a precursor to David because of the way the book ends. Ruth, in actuality, was probably written much later than the books of Joshua and Judges. It's one of the later books of the Bible and is sort of ordered as such more in the Jewish canon than it is in our Protestant canon. Everybody with me so far? All right. We need to get a little bit of background, and that print is a little small. I will read a little bit about intermarriage. One of the things we want to suggest, and I have suggested in this class before, is whenever I hear someone see someone hold the Bible up and say, I believe this is without error and the Word of God without any need of correction, and it's all one unified message. I believe the Bible is the Word of God. I think it is divinely inspired. But the idea that the Bible presents one unified message is a bunch of malarkey. The Bible is often in conversation. Biblical authors, writers' voices are often in conversation with each other. Often they are trying to correct each other. The Bible can be seen, I think more correctly, as a dialogue as opposed to a monolithic unitary message. It is an ongoing conversation. Jesus is in conversation with the authors of the Torah. He's trying to interpret the law. The book of Job is in conversation with the book of Proverbs. The book of Ruth is in conversation with the Torah, and I'm going to explain why right here. This is the language about intermarriage. When the Lord, in Deuteronomy, the Lord God brings you into the land that you're about to enter and occupy, He clears away many nations. Deuteronomy 7, Hittites, Girgashites, all the nations of the land. When the Lord your gods give you over to them to defeat them, you must utterly destroy them, make no covenant with them, and show them no mercy. Do not intermarry with them, giving your sons and daughters to their sons, or taking away their daughters for your sons, for that would turn your children away from me, following me to serve other gods. The anger of the Lord would be kindled against you, and He would destroy you quickly. For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you out of all peoples on earth to be His people, His treasured possession. Is not marriage one of the more complicated, layered institutions in any society? Fair enough? And it's important to remember, we are one of the first societies to, have an algorithm that, figures out who we're going to be compatible with and whether they're going to be fireworks, sparks, and romantic attraction. For most of the human existence, that wasn't the primary reason people got married. It had more to do with maintaining identity within a particular clan, religious group, or ethnicity, and not provoking the ire of the deity, and also making a good economic and social and cultural match. So this is more often been the case than it has been than we tend to see marriage today. But this is an important sort of marker in the Torah. Another example of this in the Torah, there is a little bit of leniency given. Don't abhor the Edomites. You shall not abhor any of the Egyptians. The children of the third generation that are born to them may be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. Seems to be there's a bit of an exception with some intermarriage, but with other of the nations, it's not acceptable. All right. So one other verse in this regard from Leviticus. This is about priests, and I'll explain. I'll show in the next slide why I'm including this. A priest should only marry a woman who's a virgin. A widow or a divorced woman has been defiled. A prostitute he shall not marry. He shall marry a virgin of his own kin, that he may not profane his offspring or seed among his kin. I am the Lord, I sanctify him. The idea here is that a priest needs to marry someone who has not been defiled and whose seed is holy. So we've got the language in Deuteronomy about not intermarrying among the nations, and then we have the language in Leviticus about priests needing to be sure to take great care who they marry. Now, let's do a brief review of Israelite history. And I'm going to focus, so we have David is crowned in 1000 or somewhere around 1000 BC. There are several hundred years of monarchy. The northern kingdom of Israel falls in the 8th century, and then in the 6th century, 586 or thereabouts, Jerusalem falls. Jerusalem falls to the Babylonians. And the people, or some of the people, are taken into exile for a period of time and under King Nebuchadnezzar. Now what happens? The Babylonians are overthrown by the Persians. So we have a new empire on the block. Cyrus the Great says to the Jewish people, you can go home. You can go home, you can rebuild the temple, you can reconstitute yourselves as a community, but you got to give me a boatload of taxation and obedience. So there's a good deal of freedom given, but there's also obligation. And during this period, this is the context in which the book of Ezra is written. Now, Ezra is a leading exilic figure who's going to restore the people to Jerusalem, and he is given a mandate to teach them the Torah. He's grateful for the opportunity, and he's going to bring the people back. But one of the things that happens when people are in a foreign land is what happens culturally when people go to a foreign place? What are some of the cultural things that might happen? Social things that might happen? Yeah, what's that? Intermarriage, interrelationship, just sort of things get a little fuzzier because you were in a different place. So it becomes more, identity becomes a bit more fluid because you're living elsewhere. Ezra doesn't like that. So here is his response. The officials approached me and said, the people of Israel, the priests and the Levites, have not separated themselves from the peoples of the lands with their abominations, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites. He's drawing directly on that language from Deuteronomy 7. He's citing it that we just saw. They have taken some of their daughters as wives for themselves and for their sons. The holy seed, this gets us back to the Leviticus passage. Ezra is putting together Deuteronomy 7, and I don't remember what chapter, was that Leviticus 23? I don't remember. Yeah, 21. The holy seed has mixed itself with the peoples of the lands, and in this faithfulness the officials and leaders have led the way. When I heard this, I tore my garment and my mantle, pulled hair from my head and beard, and sat appalled. Ezra is having a big pout. All who trembled at the words of the God of Israel because of the faithfulness of the returned exiles gathered around me while I sat appalled until the evening sacrifice. This goes on throughout Ezra 9 and 10. And what happens? Ezra sends the women and the children away. He separates the husbands from the wives and sends them away. How historically accurate is this? I'm not sure, but it definitely speaks to a very rigid understanding of identity and who can be in the community and who cannot, and a sort of a real marker about intermarriage and whether it is acceptable. So that is, in my judgment, the judgment of many others, necessary background for understanding Ruth, because Ruth is a counter to this. Ruth is a emphatic celebration to say that as long as someone worships the living God, whether they're even if they're a Moabite, they are an acceptable marriage partner, and they can be welcomed into the covenant community, and they can be a part of God's mercy. And it is, I think, it's a provocative counter, I would say, to Ezra. Therefore, I believe, as I'm not alone in this, Ruth is written in the midst of the Persian period. Oftentimes, is it fair to say that stories can be more effective than editorials at countering something? Like a story can paint a picture that is more vivid and more evocative than writing a blog on the Huffington Post. And so Ruth, I think, functions as a really interesting counter to what we find in Ezra. Now, I've talked a lot so far, I know, and this is a little bit perhaps not the way you've been introduced to Ruth before. Let me pause for a couple of seconds. We're going to get into Ruth 1 and 2 now. But does anybody have any questions about any of this so far? Objections, clarifications, anything you want to ask? Yes?
Where do the women and the children go?
In Ezra, they're sent away. That's it. They're sent away. They can go where they wish. They just can't be part of the community anymore. The last line of Ezra says they were sent away with the women were sent away with their children, and the book ends. So quite callous in this regard. Another thing to note, which is interesting, one of the things that you probably already know is we have what's called the matrilineal principle in Judaism, that Judaism tends to follow the woman. And that's true even today. One of Charlie's best friends, twins, and they have an older brother. You all may know them. He's a partner at one of the law firms. Now I'm blanking on the name. Greg Bishop and his wife Jody. Williams Mullen. So Greg is a Protestant, but his wife Jody is Jewish, and the boys are being raised. That's not always the case, but it still tends to be the case today. One question about Ezra is whether the matrilineal principle is already in operation, and that's why Ezra's so ticked about it, because identity, religious, ethnic identity, is so closely tied to the mother. And so that's one of the reasons Ruth is such an important story, but also why the children and the wives are sent away. It's a good question. Anything else? All right, let's go forward and actually look at the book of Ruth a little bit. And we'll talk about Ruth 1. I've already talked about the dating, David, and I'm not going to get into the only thing I'd say about the language is this is what I would do with Sandy and Nicole and Hannah. But the language in Ruth tends to be a little bit later Hebrew, which is another reason I think that it was written as a counter to Ezra during the Persian period. All right. Now let's go to chapter 1. All right. So what happens here? We have Elimelech, we have Mahlon and Chilion, and they come from Bethlehem, which is obviously an important city for us, an important city for our faith, an important city for David. But they go to sojourn in Moab, as one often does if farming conditions are bad, if people have reason to be there. But they all of them die. But the sons had taken Moabite wives. So now Naomi has to decide how to proceed. So she has this famous encounter with her two daughters-in-law and says, you need to go back to the place, I'm going to return, you go back to your mother's house, which is interesting because you would expect father's house, but the women in this story tend to have a really prominent role. So you have mother's house language here. And they both say to her, no, we will return with you to your people. She responds, no, go back. Orpah decides to leave, and Naomi has this speech about being bitter. Her name, Mara, means bitter. And Orpah kisses her mother-in-law and goes. And then, of course, we have the famous line that deserves to be read. Don't press me to leave you, to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There I will be buried. May the Lord do thus to me and more as well, if even death parts me from you. Naomi sees that Ruth is determined to go with her, and she said no more to her. And so then they go on to Bethlehem. Now, a couple of things to note. When they get to Bethlehem, notice in verse 19, the women said to them, is this Naomi? She said to them, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. So when Naomi returns, it does seem to be the case, coming back to our house of the father type of structure, that the women of the neighborhood provide solidarity. They provide a place to land for Naomi and for Ruth. There's been a really interesting book, if you're interested in this, called Discovering Eve by an archaeologist at Duke and who was cheering on the Blue Devils last night. She's a big basketball fan, famous biblical scholar. It wasn't much of a game. But anyway, she's written a book called Discovering Eve, in which she talks about this chapter. She refers to what she calls female solidarity networks, and that there were groups of women in localities who provided support for one another, but they also engaged in cooking and food preparation, which was of vital importance in the ancient world. Something we don't pay enough attention to. They probably did some baking, food preparation, care for children together, and they seemed to approach Naomi in a spirit of support. The women said to her, and one of the things Myers has sought to show, that in towns, small towns like Bethlehem, you would have had cooking, places for cooking and communing, and in some cases preparation of food for export that would have occurred in the midst of 3 or 4 houses, that you would have had a common space where people could gather together and meet. That seems to be what's going here at the end of Ruth 1. Now, so we have these what we call female solidarity networks. Next point I want to ask is, who's the protagonist in Ruth? The book is named after her. She's the one who has the kid, and she's the one who marries Boaz. I would submit that the real protagonist in the story is Naomi. She's the one at the heart of the story. She's the one who drives the narrative. She's the one who controls the action. She's the one who tells Ruth to go to the threshing floor. She's the one who decides to go back to Bethlehem. It's not that, that Boaz and Ruth are unimportant, but I think Naomi is the key figure in the whole book. It doesn't. I'm not trying to rename the book, but I am suggesting that she is. She has more agency in the book than Ruth does, and seems to be the one who makes the biggest decisions. And we'll look at that more next week. Now, so. Okay, the heart of the book of Ruth, and this word shows up. This is my favorite Hebrew word. It's usually it's always this little comic relief time when students come to Union. If they decide to get a tattoo of a Hebrew or Greek word, the two most common choices are Hebrew chesed, which is the word we're talking about in Ruth. Chesed means loving kindness, devotion, or loyalty. And it can refer to the loyalty God has for us. Steadfast love is the way it's always translated. So if you think of the Psalms and what we say in worship sometimes, give thanks to the Lord, for God is good. His steadfast love endures forever. That is all over the book of Psalms. The word there is hesed. God's steadfast love endures forever. But hesed doesn't just extend from God to us. That certainly is its baseline meaning. Hesed also means the loyalty human beings have for each other. It's a type of loyalty that is exemplified by Ruth's promise to Naomi, that I will not forsake you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, your God, my God. I'm going to stand by you. I'm going to do whatever it takes to provide you support. I'm not going to leave you. That is sort of hesed in action. And the word shows up 5 or 6 times in Ruth, but it is most and best exemplified by this famous passage we know so well from chapter 1. So hesed can be God's love for us, and hesed can be our loyalty or steadfast love for each other. That loyalty often is characteristic of a spousal relationship, but it doesn't have to be. In this case, it is Ruth's loyalty for her mother-in-law, both of whom have lost their spouses. Make sense? The only thing I was going to say is I had a student early in my tenure at Union who got hesed on his arm, and it was misspelled. The consonants were right, but it had one of the round vowels. I didn't say anything. I didn't have the heart to tell him. I did see, I was in Short Pump the other day, and I saw a tattoo removal place, so maybe today the technology is advanced. He could get a correction done. Anyway, okay, so I want to pause for a minute and ask a question like, just make a statement and see if you have any response to it. So this passage is often read at weddings, and rightfully so. I mean, it exemplifies what loyalty should be between two people, two partners. But isn't it worth noting that the loyalty, the hesed that is underscored in Ruth 1 is actually between a mother-in-law and her daughter-in-law. I mean, it's not between two people who are about to get married. I just find that curious. It's not to say that I don't, there are some passages that I've sort of scratched my head as to why they're read at funerals or weddings. This isn't one of them. I love it when I hear it read at weddings. But I guess it's just worth noting that, hesed can extend far beyond that, and this is not really about romantic love. It's about devotion in a larger sort of relational sense. Make sense? Okay. All right. It's also, though, it's also an example when Ruth stands up in 14 and says, "No, I'm not going to leave." You could also say this is an example of what we call chutzpah. Ruth is brave. I mean, the easiest thing to do would be for her to return to her father's house, to her mother's house, start over, try to find a Moabite guy, or at least have security in the house of her father and mother. It's far riskier for her as a foreigner to return with her mother-in-law to Bethlehem, where she might be rejected and where things are going to be a bit more precarious. So it is, I would say, a good combination of hesed and chutzpah in chapter 1. All right. They come to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest, which will be a very key point. All right. Any questions about Ruth 1? I'm going to introduce another topic next, but any questions about Ruth 1? Yeah. Here, we got one in the back.
Forgive me, it seems like my mouth is cough. Was there any limitations on what Ruth could have gone back to had she gone back to her family?
It's a very good question. One could argue that her marriage prospects might not have been as good because she, was married to a foreigner, number one. Number two, she still seems to be quite young. So marriage prospects might have been worse. Financial, economic, and cultural security would have been better because she would have had the opportunity to return to her father and mother's house. So I guess you could say it's a more courageous decision for her to go with Naomi, but a good question. Her marriage, the fact that she's so young and hasn't had kids yet would lead one to believe, and the fact that she does have kids eventually in the book, that she probably could have done so in Moab as well, but chooses not to. Good question. Yeah.
And chutzpah, again, is the difference between those two?
Hesed is loving kindness. We would define chutzpah as boldness, and sometimes we take it to mean courage, but sometimes we take it to mean, being a bit, I don't know about abrasive, but forward in a sort of assertive way. And so one could argue that Ruth is both loyal and slightly assertive and maybe, what's the word? Not uppity. It's not she's being uppity, but that she's trying to look at the right adjective. What's that? Brazen. Yeah, that would be good. Yeah, that she's kind of testing norms. So she's being loyal, but a bit brazen is a good synonym there. So, all right, next question is, where's God in this story? Have we seen God? Where's God? What is God manipulating this scene or not? One of the things, and I have to toot one of my students' horns, she's written a book called Theologies of Human Agency, Megan Strollo. I don't know if she's spoken at First before, but she's our language teacher at the seminary. She teaches Greek and Hebrew. And she's written a book in which she talks about the Megillot, the books of Esther, Lamentations, Ruth, Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes. And one of her arguments is, as we get later in the biblical tradition, as we get later in the Old Testament, there's more of a wondering about where God is. That where is God when tragedy strikes? God doesn't show up. Like if you look at Genesis, think about Genesis 3 when God comes walking in the garden and talks to the man and the woman. Think about Abraham and God. Think about Moses and God, where God talks to Abraham, God talks to Moses, God speaks to the prophet Isaiah. We get to these later books, God is far more distant. God isn't talking to these characters. They're trying to have to figure it out for themselves, wondering where God is, a bit stumbling in the dark. And one of the things Megan and others have argued is that in some of the later biblical books, God recedes a bit. And I find these books so helpful because it seems to approximate our existence a bit more, where we often wonder where God is in our lives and what God wants us to do. And, how much God's providence and predeterminism is affecting what we do. And that's a question mark in the book of Ruth. We don't really know. God shows up in, once or twice in chapter 1, ends the famine in verse 6. The Lord had considered the people and given them food. And then God provides. God doesn't show up again until the end of the book in chapter 4, when God gives the miracle of a child to Ruth when she has her son. So in between, it's not really clear where God is and how much God's hand is behind what happens. Now I'll explain what I mean by that. Now, Boaz is a man of deep faith who regularly invokes God when he speaks. So he seemed to be a very faithful Israelite, Bethlehemite man, upstanding guy. He regularly invokes God. But that is, sort of Boaz's faith rather than God's direct action. Naomi's God seems to be more distant. She has experienced tragedy. She is uncertain about whether things are going to work out, and she feels she's going to need to exercise her own agency. This shows you how good I think some of our former Union students who are FPC folks now, Nicole Ball's paper for me, I still remember it many years later, was called, she was writing about Ruth and she said, taking matters into their own hands. Naomi's agency and Naomi's human, I don't remember what the subtitle was, but she focused on taking matters into her own hands because Naomi is far more uncertain about what tomorrow's going to bring. And that's a function of the tragedy that has enveloped her, and she has every right to be uncertain and scared. And so she decides they're going to take matters into their own hands. All right, let's look at chapter 2 before we stop. Notice that Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side, prominent rich man of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. We're not entirely sure how Naomi and Boaz are related. They seem to be related in some way. Now, one of the things, this is just a side note, but an important side note, we're thinking of the house of the father system. Why would it be advantageous to marry within that system? What does that bring you? Like, why would you want to keep marriage within your house of the father unit if possible? A larger house of the father unit. What does that bring you? What are the advantages of that? Continuity, security, but think more concretely. Land, exactly. It keeps inheritance within the house of the father. Now, there's real regulations about who you can't marry. You can't marry your brother. You can't marry your sister. You can't marry your son. You can't marry your, you can't marry your aunt. You can't marry your uncle. But you can marry your cousins. You know the term, and kissing cousins, exactly. You know the term kissing cousins. It's real. This was the case in many, this has been the case in American culture at various points, especially when we were a more agrarian society. So we don't exactly know how Boaz is related to Naomi. We do know that they are related to each other. Now, so Naomi says, Ruth says, let me go into the field and glean among the ears of grain. She said, go. She came and gleaned in the field as it happened. That's not a really good translation. And I didn't put it on the PowerPoint. The Hebrew word there is mikra, M-I-Q-R-E-H. I would translate that as fate would have it. As it literally says, her fate happened upon the portion of the field belonging to Boaz. That leads us to wonder, but we don't know. There's something mysterious about this. Is this because Naomi told her where to go and what was going to happen? Or does God make that happen? More likely, it's a setup from Naomi and Ruth. They know precisely what they're doing. But it is somewhat uncertain. But I would translate that verse as fate. Her fate happened upon the portion of the field belonging to Boaz. Now, he said to the reaper, and notice the formulaic language. Boaz came from Bethlehem. He said, "The Lord be with you." They answered, "The Lord bless you." Then he sees Ruth. She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. And she says, "Please let me gather among the sheaves behind the reapers." So she came. But Boaz says to Ruth, "Do not glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Keep your eyes on the field that is being reaped and follow behind them. I've ordered the men not to bother you." Let me pause there. There's provision in Deuteronomy that the corners of the field can be gleaned at the harvest time, and the proceeds from that can be shared with those who need it. So there is sort of built-in provision in the Torah to allow sort of external people to participate in the harvest, especially if it will help them get the food they need. Now, we're back to our house of the father system, but we're also need to note that Ruth is in public. Ruth is in a public setting. She's not near Naomi, and she's not married. She's quite vulnerable. What is she vulnerable to in addition to hunger? What else might she be vulnerable to? What could happen to her this day? Sexual assault, exactly. Rape. The language here would be, look at, again, I don't like the translation, and the Greek translation is a little stronger. If I were translating this, I would say, "I have ordered the young men not to assault you." Bother's too tame. The idea here is that Ruth needs to be very careful and stay with the other women, and she needs to never find herself alone. The implication is not only that she's beautiful, but also that she's vulnerable. She's a widow, she's a foreigner. She would be an easy target for these other male gleaners who are young and out in the field. So oftentimes the Bible, in this case especially, is quite, sometimes we skip over verses that have a great deal of impact on the meaning of the book. And this would be one. I've ordered the men not to assault you, not to abuse you. And it shows the fact, another thing to note is that, women in many cases engaged in agricultural work, in textile work, and found themselves in public spaces. This is also something that Carol Myers has written about in Discovering Eve. And one of the things she says is that the public existence of women in the biblical world was quite vulnerable. And in this particular situation, Boaz is aware of this and wants to protect Ruth from sexual assault. My second book was on economics in the biblical world, and I put a painting by a French painter named Tissot on the cover, and it's a painting of Ruth gleaning in the fields in this scene with other women. And the idea behind that was to show the necessity of Ruth finding security for herself, but also her vulnerability in the social structure. So this is a really profound and sort of desperate moment for her. Yes?
Is there some expectation that sexual activity was a payback?
I don't know that that's the case. I would just say that Boaz is aware that it is a real possibility, and he's worried that it will happen. And so he's aware that Ruth in particular is going to be vulnerable. I don't know that there's a wink acknowledgement that they can have their way with her if they want to. But I do think that, again, the fact that she's a foreigner, the fact that she's a widow, the fact that she's currently unattached, all of those make her particularly vulnerable in an open field with these young men.
So are you suggesting she was there by herself, or were there other women with her?
There's other women with her gleaning in the edge of the field, but Boaz recognizes that she's not attached to them in the same way because she's not a native. And so Boaz is saying, you need to stay close to these women because you don't, she's just wandered away from Naomi and is more or less by herself. So yeah, she's quite vulnerable. Good question. All right.
10 minutes.
Okay. So they have a bit of exchange. She says, why have I found favor in your mind when I'm a foreigner? May the Lord reward you for your deeds. And she says, may I continue to find favor? They have a meal. She's fed, and she gleans in the field and works hard until the evening. And her mother-in-law sees how much she's gleaned. She took out and gave her what was left after she herself had been satisfied. I'm on verse 19. She said, where did you glean today? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. She said, the name of the man with whom I work is Boaz. Naomi, her daughter-in-law, said, blessed be the Lord, whose kindness is not forsaken the living or the dead. All right, kindness here is hesed, whose loving kindness, whose loyalty. So Naomi is saying God's loyalty has not forsaken us. But the question remains, how much does Naomi trust in that? And how much is she about to take matters into her own hands? She believes in God, but she's about to do something quite assertive. All right. This man, Naomi also said, the man is a relative of ours. Come back to our kissing cousins. Ruth the Moabite said, he even said to me, stay close with me by my young men until they have finished all the harvest. Naomi said to her Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it is better, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, otherwise someone might assault you in another field. So she stayed close to the young woman of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. All right, I've already talked about all that. All right, now, we've got about 5-7 minutes left. We need to think about this pivotal break in the story. Now, an opportunity has presented itself, right? And Naomi recognizes that. And here is, to me, the hinge point, the turn, the pivotal moment in the story happens in Ruth 3:1, where Naomi says, Naomi, her mother-in-law, said, my daughter-in-law, I need to seek some security for you so that it may be well with you. All right, I need to seek some security for you that it may be well with you. In that sense, she's also seeking security, not just for Ruth, but also for herself. Exactly. Understandably so. She's not just worried about food, basic daily security. The story will also unfold. She's worried about land inheritance. She's worried about what's going to happen to the ancestral property that is in her family. That she doesn't necessarily have a right to inherit. We'll talk about female inheritance next week, but she's worried about whether that will happen. Now, so here's what I want you to do for next week, and then we'll have some time for questions, just whatever you want to ask. I want you to read Ruth 3 very carefully as to what you think is going on. What happens? Does Ruth, in your judgment, these are cryptic, difficult verses, does Ruth initiate a sexual encounter? Is that what Naomi's asking her to do? Or is something else going on? And when Boaz wakes up, does he wake up knowing that a sexual encounter has just happened? And is that why he freaks out? So read through those verses and see what you think. Then read carefully through chapter 4. They're both very short. Think about the house of the father issue. What is going on in this legal scene? Who is this unnamed next of kin? The Hebrew's great here. This Mr. So-and-so, this dude. The Hebrew is Poloni Almoni. Poloni Almoni. So this dude shows up who's related to Boaz, but he seems to be a closer relative to Naomi than Boaz is. Why does he refuse? Why does he say, I don't want the inheritance? What's going on? Why does he refuse? And then what law is being applied in this passage? What is the law from Deuteronomy that's being applied when someone loses their husband? So read Ruth 3, see what you think of the sexual encounter. Read Ruth 4, see what you think of the legal encounter. Final point that we'll talk about some next week, how do we read Ruth today? How do we read Ruth in February of 2025? And yes, I'm going to say it, when there's so much xenophobia happening. So how do we approach Ruth in February of 2025 in the midst of our current context? What message might it bring to us? What is the assertiveness of what Ruth is saying against Ezra, and how might that inform our own faith and lives? All right, so we do have like 3 or 4 minutes. I'm excited. I was with Amy some over the weekend, so I'm excited about hearing her sermon. I'm not going to make anybody late, but we have like 2 minutes for anybody have any final questions on this or thoughts? Yeah, go ahead. We'll get to Ruth 3 and 4 next week. Yeah.
Okay, no, this is, so when Naomi went back, did she go back to her side, her family, or her husband's family?
No, her husband's dead.
I know, but
So she goes back to Bethlehem and is welcomed by the women. She does have relatives, it seems, including Boaz, but she doesn't have close relatives anymore.
but it's her family, not her lady.
Yes, not her. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it seems to be that it's her relatives. It's not entirely clear, actually. It's not clear. We don't know. We do know that. It's not clear if she's going to be able to hold on to her land and if she's going to be able to survive. Who exactly? Now, we don't know how the Poloni, Almoni, and Boaz are related to Ruth and Naomi. We do know that they're not Elimelech's brother, because if it were, they would say it. So it seems to be some sort of cousin type relationship, and perhaps Boaz is a second cousin and the Poloni Almoni is a first cousin. That's just a suggestion, but that would be my read on it. Very good question. There was another hand.
I'm curious, what do you think of the translation of when Naomi says to Ruth, I need to find security for you, that need, what is that?
Yeah, let me look at it. That's a really good question. There's a sense of wit. Let me look here.
I just feel like it could be, I want, or I'm desperate, or
All right, so I'm sorry, I have to pick this up. Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, my daughter, is it not that I should seek for you a resting place so that it may go well for you? It's like, it would say, I don't like that translation. It would be like, it seems like it's really important that I solve this right now. Like it's like, in other words, I would translate it as Naomi said to her mother-in-law said to her, my daughter, we're in big trouble. I better seek some security for you. I need to seek some security for you in the sense that there's an urgency. So I guess that is the way it says it. But it's like, I must do this because we're at a and this is why, so I think the whole book hinges on this verse, and that's why I think Naomi is the main protagonist in the book, and Ruth is a very important character, but ultimately a supporting actress, and that the book is really about what Naomi decides is going to happen.
Is Naomi in some way using Ruth?
Yes.
For her own benefit?
Yes, yes,
Well-being?
yes.
Yeah.
So the question is, how favorably we want to look upon Naomi? It's a good question, and once we factor in what we think about what's happening in Ruth 3, it gets even more complicated. Now, along these lines, other thing I want you to think about when you read Ruth 3 is how should we engage this story with kids? Because it's often engaged with kids, and I'm like, whoa, okay. Because of the loyalty that the characters show for each other, but the scene in Ruth 3, however we read it, is NC-17. I mean, it's rated R. So we have to decide how we're going to engage that. One more question, we better stop, right, Drake? Yeah.
Sorry, and I missed earlier. Did you speak at all about, the loyalty between the two women and how, because I see the need almost as, at first Naomi seems a little reluctant that Ruth is like, yeah, I'm going to come with you.
Yeah.
You are mine. And I see at the start of 3 that like Naomi is now changing that apathetic state towards her to a more, like, you are my family. I need to care for you as
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think she has changed her mind. And what's changed her mind is Ruth's going to Boaz's field, and she's, there's a connection that's been made. And I do think she's changed toward Ruth. And I'm not suggesting that she doesn't love and care for Ruth and doesn't have hesed for Ruth. But Drake asks the fundamental question, is she also using Ruth? And an argument could be made that she is, that she's using her. And an even more, there are feminist commentators writing on Ruth today who would say that Naomi's exploiting Ruth. And that's another thing we want to talk about next week. So I don't know how I feel about that, but there's a lot of conversation. Drake, in my judgment, Drake raises the big question, and it all hinges on how you read chapter 3, following those verses.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Completely off of all that?
Yeah, sure.
When her husband died, is it culturally acceptable that the widow is just totally forgotten by the husband's family?
No, and that's where we get into what's happening next week. It's not culturally acceptable. The idea is that the widow will be protected and maintained, and this is when we get to the custom that is Deuteronomy 20, I believe, called levirate marriage. And that's what we're going to talk about next week, where it is obligatory for the brother of the deceased to marry the widow in order to keep the widow within the household. Even if he doesn't love her, even if that's kind of ooky, but like that would happen as a means of maintaining the widow. But now the problem in Ruth is there's no living brothers. Elimelech doesn't have any living brothers, so we have these other relatives. I know we got to stop, so we'll put a pin in this. Ruth 3 and 4 next week. Good discussion.